It's come around again faster than an extremely high average speed.
Welcome along to Ask GC Anything.
So without further ado, let's get on with the first question. And this is from Peter Davis via Twitter. I'm a 48-year-old novice looking to conquer a local, very steep hill. What training regimen would you recommend? Now, thanks for getting in touch, Peter, but this is a very common question asked by experienced riders and novices alike. And to be perfectly honest with you, there's not that many shortcuts to getting up particularly steep hills quickly, aside from regularly riding them and getting used to that sort of effort, because it is pretty hard. But it is a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's very difficult for us to give any training regimens to anyone out there because everybody is so different, and the type of efforts that you do in your training to prepare for your local steep climb will very much depend on how long that local steep climb is going to take you. But you should also put a lot of consideration into the gears that you use. That will be extremely important to allow you to ride up it, and make sure you get into one of those easier gears before you start it. Once you're on a steep climb, there's an enormous amount of torque going through the chain. It does make it hard to change gears, and having it in the right gear beforehand will mean that you just have to concentrate on getting up the climb itself.
Definitely, and for a few more tips on how to go up steep hills faster, how about checking this video out here? Do you ride steep climbs in or out of the saddle? Well, in short, it depends on you. And if you favour one over the other, that's probably for the best.
And the advantage of riding in the saddle is that if your gears permit, you can spin an easier gear, meaning that you're going to end up doing less muscle damage. Now that may or may not matter, it just depends how long and how many climbs that you're going to have to ride. And then, if the climb is really steep, then it's also going to help you maintain traction at the rear wheel by keeping more weight over it.
Our next question comes in from Sam, who asks, how do I get over my descending fear? Well, this is something that you certainly shouldn't be rushing in any way, shape or form, but it's also something that you shouldn't be neglecting. After all, having confidence, particularly on descents, is imperative if you want to remain safe out on the open road. So what we would suggest is that you head out to a nice local descent and ride it multiple times, preferably at a quiet time of day with minimal traffic, and gradually build your confidence up as the weeks progress.
Yeah, focus on building your speed gradually with the strict rule of not to ride outside what you feel is comfortable, and then your skills will come on in leaps and bounds, and that way there's less chance of you having any knockbacks as well. So nice and gradual, slowly build up on some really solid foundations. And for some more tips on how to descend, we've got a top 10 just up here.
Look where you want to go. When descending, you need to look at the road ahead and soak up all the information you can that will help to tell you how fast you can go. But ultimately, it's important to look at the line you want to take, not at the things you want to avoid. You'll find that you naturally ride where you look, so take your eyes off that pothole.
Time now for the rapid fire round. First up, thank you Dan, we have this from Jamie Shardlow. Is there a preferred position on cassette and chainring to leave your chain on between rides? Now personally speaking, with mechanical gears, I generally leave it on the small ring, on the inner ring and on the smaller sprocket, and actually puts less tension on the front mech and the rear mech, and also less tension on the cables, though a lot of cables these days are actually pre-stretched. But electronic gearing, I tend to do the same as well, although it probably doesn't have the same.
Just out of habit, yeah. Next question comes in from Andrew Feary, who says, a question for Ask GC Anything. What occupations have a lot of pros come from during their amateur years? Well, we've just been having a think about this, haven't we? On this week's GCN show, we mentioned the fact that Evelyn Stevens is retiring from cycling at the end of the year and going back to being a banker in New York, which is an occupation she had before she started professional cycling. But we were a little bit stuck for other actual occupations. I personally was a window cleaner before I was a professional cyclist, but that was solely a way of earning money effectively to fund my amateur career to get me to where I wanted to be.
And I worked at a department store before I was a professional cyclist, then went into the police and then did this, so my career's been a bit strange. But another one I can think of, a current pro, rides for Lotto and our Jumbo, Primoz Roglic, was a ski jumper.
Yeah, there's an occupation for you.
Indeed.
Right, next question comes from Darren Cam, who says, hi GCN, I was just wondering, does removing the back wheel whenever I wash my bike affect my gears indexing over time? Well, the short answer is no, it shouldn't do. Cables do stretch slightly. I think I got told off for saying they stretch, but effectively it means that the mech moves down slightly over time, especially if you've got a new bike. So that might be something that will affect it, but taking your wheel or taking it out and putting it back in shouldn't affect it at all.
Well, next up we've got this from David White. How do you keep sweat out of your eyes? Dan must have a system so the gel doesn't sting. I like that one, Dave.
Yeah, I don't. I don't actually have a system. I don't tend to sweat too much down my brow, but if you use mitts, they've often got that toweling, haven't they, on here? So if you do suffer from that particularly, you can just wipe it off with your mitts.
And many of the helmets these days have a little bit of sponge just on the inside, and that absorbs a lot of sweat. And I think the helmets we're using at the moment, the cast helmets, do have that in there. So don't really get
or helmet pad.
Helmet pad, sorry, made of high density sponge.
Okay, next up from Andy Roger. When did it become acceptable to thump the top of the handlebars when you don't win a sprint? Long time ago, I think.
I think a long time ago.
We did a lot of thumping of bars.
We
in our
pretty
time,
much
didn't we?
primarily
Very
thumped
little
our bars.
raising of the hands.
Most races.
And finally, for our quick fire round, Irving Abbott. I ask a few questions, but I get no answer. I'm on a red list. How does the Tour de France pick what team gets the yellow helmets? Well, first off, Irving, you're not on a red list. We get lots of questions each and every week. But in answer to your question, the yellow helmets are given to the team currently leading the general classification in the team classification. And somebody below actually replies, and that generally means the team with most riders high up GC. And it probably does generally mean that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the team with the most riders high up GC, because how it's worked is the first 3 riders from a team on any particular stage, and it doesn't have to be the same 3 riders. So it really favours teams who manage to get multiple riders into breakaways that stay away from the peloton by the finish.
Very well explained, Dan.
Thank you.
Next up we have this from Stephen, who asks, what is the difference between a normal gel and or without caffeine and an isotonic gel? Hashtag talkback. And Dan, have you got your science glasses ready to answer this one?
I haven't, no, but I'm going to attempt to explain it.
Go
so
for it.
Effectively, an isotonic gel doesn't contain any calories. It is solely there to try and help hydrate. So it contains a lot of electrolytes, whereas a normal gel, I think what you're referring to is one that does contain fast-acting carbohydrates that can actually fuel your body throughout the ride.
Yeah, and for how to exactly make energy gels work for you, you can find out by watching this little video.
I think the first thing that we need to understand is exactly what is contained within our gels. So we mentioned just now that they are in essence water and carbohydrates. However, the type of carbohydrates can change, as can the amount of carbs and also the amount of water. And it's these 3 things that we need to take into consideration when we're deciding how and when to use our gels.
Well, let's look at water first. Now, in order for food to be absorbed quickly by your gut, you're going to need a certain amount of water in there. Otherwise, you risk having a bloated stomach, or at the very least, the food will take longer to be absorbed. So, when you have a gel, it's best to take some water with it, unless the gel is isotonic. And in that case, you won't need any water at all, as the gel will quickly be absorbed itself.
And finally, we have this question from Andrew Green, who asks, I know how useful power meters and heart rate monitors are for training. Do pros use them when racing? Well, the pretty definitive answer from that is the vast majority of pros do use power meters when racing, and quite a large number still do use heart rate straps, and you can actually see those, especially with the very thin clothing you're using these days. But I think the number that use heart rate monitors as well is slightly decreasing. But yeah, very commonplace now, Dan, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. As to how much they actually use the power meters in the racing, well, it's difficult to say. Some riders won't look at them at all, and in fact, as you pointed out to me earlier, they'll actually put the tape over the power number, so it's all about the post-ride on race analysis. Although a lot of riders will use them for pacing, especially in longer time trials, for example. So it is all about the post-race analytics, and if you're new to that kind of thing, we actually did this video very recently where we looked at 5 metrics that we personally look at after our rides.
Now, the first of these is normalised power. This was a metric that was devised by Dr. Andy Coggan, and it takes into account power variance through your ride. So the difference between a hill interval session and a longer, steadier ride. Now, what it does is it gives you the most accurate indication of the true physiological cost of your workout.
Yeah, it's much more representative of the real effort that you've put into a ride versus average power, which is simply a numerical average. So to give you a real world example, if you went out for 1 hour and held a steady 200 watts throughout, your average power and your normalised power would be 200 watts. On the other hand, if you did the first 20 minutes at 100 watts, the second 20 at 200, and the third 20 at 300, your average would still be 200 watts, but your normalised power would be 240. Much more representative of the fact that you dug quite deep in the last 20 minutes.
Well, that's it for another Ask GCN Anything. Thanks very much for your questions, and do make sure you keep them coming in the comment section down below on Facebook and on Twitter too.
You might have noticed I've got a special t-shirt on to celebrate the fact that the Vuelta is just about to start. You can buy this if you want by heading over to shop.globalcyclingnetwork.com.
And talking of the Vuelta, we've got our preview show. You can find that by clicking just up there.
Meanwhile, the video down at the bottom there is where Tom Last takes a look around the factory of Trek over in the US.
A top tech tour, no less. And subscribe to GCN as ever, click on the globe.